not leaving until I say so," he said, and his voice slid down my spine like a drop of ice water. I froze at the edge of the pool, feeling his shadow fall on my back, though he didn't even move. "My name is Lina. I'm 22, and I never thought I'd find myself in such a trap. My mother, her husband Roman, and I went on holiday to the coast, a small resort town where the sun melted the asphalt and the sea whispered of freedom. Roman is 57. He always seemed like a figure from another world to me. Tall, with gray hair at the temples, silent, with a habit of looking a little longer than necessary. My mother married him 3 years ago, and I was used to thinking of him as just a part of her life, not mine. But this summer everything changed. Mom loved excursions. She could wander around old streets for hours, photograph ruins, and listen to the guide, while I preferred to laze by the water. That day, she left with a group for the whole day, some ruins in the mountains that promised breathtaking views. Roman and I stayed at the hotel. I didn't see anything strange in this. He usually read a book on the terrace, and I swam in the pool or lay on a sun lounger with headphones. But that day the air was different, thick, heavy, like before a thunderstorm. I walked out to the pool in a new bathing suit, black, with thin straps that barely covered my body. It wasn't that I wanted to impress him, it was just lying on top of me in my suitcase, and I was hot. The water sparkled in the sun, and I dove in, feeling the coolness embrace my skin. When I emerged, I noticed him. Roman was standing at the edge of the terrace, leaning on the railing, and watching. Not just watching, his gaze was like a beam that couldn't be turned off. I climbed out of the water, drops running down my legs, and suddenly realized that I couldn't look away. "Lina," he said, and his voice was lower than usual, with a slight hoarseness, "aren't you afraid of getting sunburned?" I shrugged, trying to appear indifferent. "I have some cream somewhere in my bag." He nodded, but didn't move away. Instead, he walked down the steps to the pool, slowly, as if drawing out the moment. He was wearing a white linen shirt, unbuttoned across the chest, and shorts, nothing out of the ordinary, but something about the way he walked made my heart beat faster. I sat down on a lounge chair, drying my hair with a towel, and he stopped a few feet away. "Let me help you," he said, pointing to the tube of sunscreen I had thrown down next to him. I could have refused. I could have said I could handle it myself, but instead I handed him the cream and turned my back. His fingers touched my shoulders, warm, slightly rough, confident. He rubbed the cream in slowly, as if he were drawing something invisible on my skin. I held my breath, feeling the warmth of his hands spread through my body, mixing with the heat of the day. It was wrong, I knew, but I couldn't stop him. "Are you always this quiet?" he asked, his voice closer than I expected. I glanced over my shoulder. His face was in shadow from the sun, but his eyes were shining dark, deep, like the sea at night. "And you?" I replied, trying to regain control. "You usually keep quiet more than you speak." He smiled, not the usual polite smile I had seen at dinner with my mother, but something different, sharp, almost predatory. "Maybe I just have no one to talk to," he said, and his hand slid a little lower, to her shoulder blades. I tensed, but didn't pull away. The thought kept running through my head, what am I doing? This was Roman, my mother's husband, the man who should have remained at a safe distance. But here, by the pool, with his hands on my skin, the distance disappeared. "You shouldn't do this," I said quietly, but my voice trembled, giving me away. "And you shouldn't let me," he replied, and there was not a drop of regret in his tone. He took his hands away, but didn't move away. Instead, he sat down on the lounge chair next to me, looking at me as if he was waiting for me to do next. I stood up, feeling my heart pounding in my chest, and stepped toward the water. I dove in again, hoping the cool air would wash away this strange feeling, but when I emerged, he was still watching. "You're playing with fire, Lina," he said, and his words hung in the air like a warning. I climbed out of the pool, water dripping from my hair, and walked closer to him than I should have. "And you?" I asked, leaning forward a little so that the drops fell on his shirt. "You're here too, aren't you?" His gaze flickered, barely noticeable, but I caught it. He stood up, so close I could feel the warmth of his breath, but he didn't touch me again. Instead, he stepped back and said, "Let's go inside. It's too hot here." I nodded, though I knew the heat wasn't just in the air. We walked into the room, cool and air-conditioned, but the silence between us was louder than any noise. I threw my towel on a chair and sat on the sofa. He stopped by the window, looking out at the sea. "Have you ever thought about quitting?" I asked, not knowing why. He turned around and his face was serious, without the playfulness that had been there by the pool. "Every day," he replied. "But quitting doesn't mean walking away. Sometimes it means taking what you want. My throat was dry. I stood up and walked towards him, stopping in mid-step. His eyes followed my every move, but he didn't move. "What do you want?" I asked, feeling my voice tremble with tension. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer to me, closing the distance to a minimum. I felt the heat of his body, saw his chest rise and fall slowly. But he didn't touch me. "And you?" he asked in response, and his voice was like the whisper of the wind before a storm. I didn't know what to say. My mind was a mess, thoughts of my mom, of how wrong this was, of how far we've come without even crossing the line. I stepped back, feeling the floor cool against my bare feet. "I need to take a shower," I said, almost running towards the bathroom. Closing the door, I turned on the water and stood under the stream, trying to wash away this feeling, a mixture of fear, desire, and something else that had no name. When I came out, wrapped in a towel, he was not in the room. Only an open window and a light breeze stirring the curtains. But it didn't end there. In the evening, when the sun had set, he came back. I was sitting on the balcony, looking at the city lights, when I heard his footsteps. He sat down next to me, putting 2 glasses of wine on the table. "I won't apologize," he said, looking me in the eye. "But don't apologize either." I took the glass, feeling the glass cool my fingers. "For what?" I asked. "Because we're both here," he replied, and his gaze became that same one again, deeply piercing, from which one could not hide. We sat in silence, the wine untouched. The tension between us grew with each passing second, but neither of us took the next step. And when I went to bed that night, closing my eyes, I knew this wasn't the end. Something was going to happen, or break. But not today. The next morning, I woke to the sound of waves coming through the half-open window. The light was soft and golden, but the tension from the night before was still in my chest, like a stone that couldn't be moved. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had happened by the pool, on the balcony, in every conversation we'd had. Roman wasn't the man I'd known before. Or maybe I just didn't want him to be like that. I came down to breakfast later than usual. The hotel restaurant was quiet, a couple of elderly tourists at the window, a waiter lazily wiping down tables. Roman was not there. I ordered coffee and toast, but the food tasted bland. My thoughts were all over him. Where was he? What was he doing? And most importantly, what did I want from all this? When I returned to the room, he was there. He was standing at the table, sorting through some papers, probably something work-related. He always carried a laptop with him, even on vacation. He was wearing the same white shirt, only the sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, revealing his tanned forearms. He raised his head, and his gaze ran over me again, not quickly, but slowly, as if he was studying every detail. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, and there was no hint of yesterday's game in his voice. "Not really," I answered, sitting down on the sofa and pulling my knees up to my chest. "And you?" He shrugged, not taking his eyes off the papers. "A couple of hours is enough for me." I looked at him, trying to find something in his face, regret, awkwardness, anything. But he was calm, like the sea before a storm. And that made me angry. Why could he sit there as if nothing had happened, when I felt like a taut string about to snap? "Are you always like this?" I asked, unable to restrain myself. He raised his eyebrows, put the papers down and turned to me. "Which one?" "Like you don't care," I said, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. "Yesterday and now you're just sitting there reading your papers." He stood up and came closer, stopping at the edge of the sofa. His shadow fell on my knees, and I involuntarily tensed. "I care, Lina," he said quietly, "but I'm not going to pretend I can control it." His words hung between us, heavy as damp air before rain. I wanted to ask him what he meant, but instead I stood up, bringing him face to face. We were so close I could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the light stubble on his chin. But he didn't move, and neither did I. "Then why are you doing this?" I asked, feeling my throat tighten. "Why are you coming so close, saying things like that?" He tilted his head as if considering his answer. "Because you don't leave," he said finally. "And I like that." I opened my mouth to protest, but the words stuck. He was right. I could have left yesterday. I could have locked myself in my room. I could have called my mother and made up any excuse to escape. But I stayed. And now I stood here, looking at him, not knowing what to do next. "I need to go for a walk," I said, looking away and grabbing my bag from the chair. He didn't stop me. He just nodded, and I felt his gaze on my back until I closed the door behind me. The streets of the town were narrow, cobbled, with bright flowers in pots outside each house. I walked aimlessly, breathing in the salty air, but my thoughts wouldn't let go. Roman was an enigma, a man who seemed both familiar and alien. I knew his habits, how he drank coffee without sugar, how he wrinkled his forehead when he read something difficult. But yesterday I saw another side of him, the one he hid behind that mask of calm. And this side pulled me like a magnet, although I understood that it was dangerous. I reached the beach, deserted, with small waves lazily rolling onto the shore. I sat on the sand, pulled my knees up, and watched the sun rise higher. The hours dragged on, but I was in no hurry to return. I needed time to sort myself out. It was already dark when I got back to the hotel. Mom was supposed to arrive the next morning, and I had almost convinced myself that I could pretend that nothing had happened. But when I opened the door to my room, I saw him. Roman was sitting on the balcony, a glass of wine in his hand, looking at me as if he had been waiting all day. "You took a long time," he said, and there was no reproach in his voice, only a statement. "I needed to think," I replied, throwing my bag on the sofa. He nodded, put his glass down, and stood up. He took a step toward me, and I felt the air between us thicken again. "And what did you decide?" he asked, stopping a step away from me. I looked into his eyes, trying to find an answer. But instead I said, "I don't know. And you?" He smiled, not that sharp smile, but a soft, almost sad one. "Me too," he admitted. "But I think we both know we can't stop now." His words hit me like a wave. I backed up against the wall, feeling the cold concrete penetrate the fabric of my shirt. He didn't follow me, but his gaze held me tighter than his hands. "This is wrong," I said, more to myself than to him. "I know," he replied. "But you're still here." I swallowed, feeling my pulse pounding in my temples. He was right, I hadn't left, and that was what scared me most of all. "I need to sleep," I said, turning away and heading towards my room. "Good night, Lina," he said after me, and his voice was soft, but with the same note that haunted me. I closed the door but didn't lock it. I lay on my bed, staring into the darkness, and tried to convince myself that tomorrow it would all be over. Mom would come back, and we would go back to our normal lives. But deep down, I knew it was a lie. Something had already begun between us, and it wouldn't just disappear. The night was long. I tossed and turned, falling asleep and waking up from the sound of the wind outside the window. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, his shadow, his gaze, his hands that never crossed the final line. And that was the worst part, not what he had done, but what he could have done, and that I might have wanted it. In the morning, I woke up to the sound of the door opening. My mother's voice echoed throughout the room. "Lina, Roman, I'm back. Where are you?" I sat up in bed, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. I looked out into the living room. My mother was standing with a bag in her hands, and Roman was helping her carry her things in. He looked at me over her shoulder, and something flashed in his eyes. Not a smile, not regret, but something in between. "Hi, Mom," I said, forcing a smile. "How was the tour?" "Oh, fantastic," she began, unpacking her bag. "How did you spend your time?" I glanced at Roman. He was silent, but his silence was louder than any words. "It's fine," I answered, feeling my voice tremble. "We were just relaxing." Mom didn't notice. She continued talking about the mountains and old temples, and I sat there, looking at the floor, trying not to think about what had happened yesterday. But Roman came closer, putting his bag down next to the sofa, and his hand accidentally or not accidentally touched mine. It was fleeting, but enough to make me flinch. "I'm going to take a shower," he said, looking at my mother, but I knew those words were for me too. When he left, I stayed with my mother, but I felt like a stranger in that room. Everything was back to normal, or should have been. But I knew there was a shadow between Roman and me that couldn't be erased, and no matter what happened next, that week had changed us both. My mother's voice was still ringing in my ears as she laid out souvenirs on the table, magnets, postcards, some bracelets made of colored threads. She was in high spirits, full of impressions from the trip, and didn't notice how I sat there, clenching my fingers into fists to hide my trembling. Roman came out of the shower, his hair still damp, drops of water glistening on his neck. He looked as usual, calm, collected, as if nothing had happened. But I knew it was a mask. "Lina, you're pale," Mom said, finally looking at me. "Is everything okay?" "I'm just tired," I replied, forcing a smile. "The heat has worn me out." She nodded, not paying attention, and turned back to her things. Roman sat down on the sofa, picking up one of the postcards, but I saw his gaze slide to me quick, almost imperceptible, but sharp as a blade. I stood up, muttering something about tea, and went into the kitchen. I needed space, at least a few minutes without his presence. The kitchen was small, with a window overlooking the sea. I turned on the kettle, watching the steam rise to the ceiling, and tried to collect my thoughts. Mom was back, and that should have changed everything. But instead of relief, I felt the tension tightening in my chest. Every sound from the living room, her laughter, his deep voice, felt like part of some play in which I didn't know my role. As the kettle clicked, I heard footsteps. Roman walked in, holding an empty bottle of water. "Will you pour me some too?" he asked, placing the bottle on the table. I nodded without looking at him and reached for my cup. But he didn't move away. Instead, he leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest, and I could feel his gaze like the heat of a lamp on my skin. "You're avoiding me," he said quietly so his mother wouldn't hear. I froze, holding the kettle in my hands. Hot water almost splashed on my fingers, but I managed to put it back in place. "And you don't?" I answered, finally looking at him. His eyes were dark, impenetrable, but the corner of his mouth twitched, not a smile, but something like recognition. "I'm trying," he said, "but it's not as easy as it looks." I swallowed, feeling my pulse pounding in my throat. Mom was in the next room, 10 feet away, and here we were, teetering on the edge of something we couldn't name. "Then why are you here?" I asked, lowering my voice. "Why are you coming if you're trying?" He straightened up, taking a step closer. His shirt smelled of the sea and something tart, maybe cologne, maybe wine from last night. "Because you don't disappear," he said. "Even when I close my eyes, you're still there." His words hit me like a gust of wind, and I backed up toward the sink, palms braced against the cold metal. He didn't follow, but the distance between us still felt too small. "This isn't normal," I whispered. "You understand, right?" "I understand," he replied, a hint of weariness in his voice. "But that doesn't change how I feel." I opened my mouth to object, but at that moment my mother shouted from the living room. "Lina, where are you? Bring me some water, please." I grabbed the bottle he brought and quickly filled it, trying not to look at him. As I passed by, his fingers trembled slightly, as if he wanted to touch me, but he held back. I only exhaled when I was next to my mother. "Thank you, dear," she said, taking the bottle. "Roman, will you have some tea too?" "No," he answered, leaving the kitchen. "I'd rather take a walk." He left, and I was left with my mother, but her chatter about the trip passed me by. I nodded, smiled, but thought only of his footsteps fading down the hallway. He was gone, but his words remained, heavy as stones in my pockets, weighing me down. The day passed in a strange haze. The three of us went to the beach, and Mom insisted on taking advantage of the last day of rest. She lay under an umbrella with a book, and I sat by the water, watching the waves lick the sand. Roman was nearby, but not too close, about 5 meters away, spreading out a towel and looking at the horizon. I tried not to look at him, but it was impossible. His silhouette was outlined against the sunset, broad shoulders, slightly hunched back, as if he were carrying something invisible. Mom fell asleep, the book fell from her hands, and the beach was emptied. Tourists went to bars and restaurants. I got up and walked to the water, feeling the sand burning my feet. Roman got up after me. I didn't hear his footsteps, but I knew he was following me. His presence was like a shadow that couldn't be shaken. "Can't you just leave it?" I asked without turning around as the water touched my ankles. He stopped a couple of steps behind. "Can you?" he answered, his voice soft but with the same strength as yesterday. I turned and the wind blew my hair into my face. He stood looking at me, and the sun was setting behind him, turning the sea crimson. "I don't know what you want," I said, feeling my voice tremble. "But I can't continue this." He stepped closer, but stopped when the water reached his knees. "I'm not asking you to continue," he said. "I'm asking you not to pretend it didn't happen." I clenched my fists, feeling my nails dig into my palms. He was right. I could leave, I could forget, but something inside me wouldn't let go. It wasn't desire, not passion, but something deeper, like a thread connecting us that I couldn't break. "And then what?" I asked. "Mom will come home, we will come back to life, and then what?" He looked at me for a long time, silently, and something flashed in his eyes, not an answer, but a question that he did not ask. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I don't want it to end here." I stepped back, feeling the water splash around my feet. "It's over now," I said, but my voice sounded unconvincing even to myself. He didn't answer. He just stood there, looking at me, until the sun sank below the horizon, leaving us in the twilight. I turned and walked back to my mother, feeling his gaze following me. The night passed quietly. We had dinner in the hotel restaurant. Mom chatted about plans for tomorrow. Roman nodded, and I picked at the food on my plate, not feeling the taste. When we returned to the room, I immediately went to my room, closing the door. But sleep did not come. I lay there, looking into the darkness, and tried to figure out what to do next. In the morning we packed our things. Mom bustled about, checking if we had forgotten anything. Roman silently carried the suitcases to the car. I stood by the window, looking out at the sea, and felt something tightening inside. It was the end of the vacation, but not the end of what had begun between us. It was quiet in the car. Mom turned on the radio, humming a tune, and I sat in the back, looking out the window. Roman was driving, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. Once our eyes met in the rearview mirror, a brief, almost accidental moment, but it burned me like a spark. When we got home, everything went back to normal. Mom went to unpack. I went to my room. Roman did something in the garage. But every time I passed him in the hallway or heard his voice from the kitchen, I felt this shadow, invisible, but real. And I knew, this is not the end. Something remains between us, unspoken, unfinished. And one day this shadow will return to take its own. Everything at home was familiar and strange at the same time. The kitchen smelled of coffee. My mother's flowers on the windowsill were slightly wilted from their long absence, and in the hallway lay a stack of letters that no one had had time to sort through. I dropped my bag in my room and closed the door, hoping that the walls would separate me from what I had brought with me from my vacation. But it was impossible. Roman was everywhere, in the sound of footsteps on the wooden floor, in the deep voice coming from the living room, in the way his shadow flickered in the doorway as he passed by. The first few days, I tried to avoid him. I left early in the morning, walked in the park, sat in a cafe with a laptop, pretending to be busy. Mom didn't notice anything. She was absorbed in her own affairs, work, flowers, endless calls to friends. Roman also seemed the same. He read the newspaper at breakfast, fixed something in the garage, talked to Mom about the weather. But every time we found ourselves in the same room, the air became thick, like before a thunderstorm. One evening, I didn't have time to leave. Mom was late at work, and I was sitting on the couch with a book I hadn't read. Roman walked in with a mug in his hands, black tea, no sugar, just the way he liked it. He sat down in the chair opposite me, and the silence between us rang like a taut string. "You've become more silent," he said, taking a sip. I looked up from my book, feeling my heart pounding in my ribs. "And you don't," I answered, trying to sound indifferent. He placed the mug on the table, his fingers hovering over the ceramic handle. "I thought we agreed not to pretend," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. I squeezed the book so hard that the pages crumpled under my fingers. "I'm not pretending," I said. "I just want this to be over." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and looked at me as if he was seeing me for the first time. "It won't end, Lina," he said. "It's not that simple." I stood up, throwing the book on the sofa, and stepped towards the window. The night outside, the glass was black. Only the streetlights were reflected in the puddles after the rain. "You can't decide for me," I said, looking at my reflection. "This is my life." He stood up and came closer, not right next to me, but close enough for me to feel the warmth of his presence. "I don't decide," he said, "but I see that you feel the same as I do." I turned to him sharply, and our gazes met. His eyes were dark, deep, like the sea in a storm, and there was not a drop of doubt in them. "You're wrong," I said, but my voice wavered, giving me away. He stepped closer, and I leaned my back against the windowsill. The wood was cold, but the heat of his body was stronger. He didn't touch me, but the distance between us shrank to a thread, ready to snap. "Then go away," he said quietly. "Right now." I could. The door was 3 steps away, my room 5. But I stood there, feeling my breathing become heavy, his words digging into me like needles. "I can't," I whispered, and it was the admission I feared most. His face changed, not a smile, not triumph, but something like pain. He raised his hand, but stopped a centimeter from my shoulder. I saw his fingers tremble, barely, but it was there. "Then what do we do?" he asked, his voice hoarse, as if he was holding himself back with all his might. I swallowed, feeling my throat go dry. "I don't know," I said, "but I don't want Mom to know." He nodded, lowering his hand, but he didn't back away. We stood like that, close but not touching, and the silence between us was louder than any scream. At that moment the front door slammed. Mom's voice cut through the air. "And Ho, where are you?" I flinched, stepping away from Roman, and he took a step back, returning to the chair. When Mom came in, he was already holding a mug in his hands, and I was standing by the window, pretending to look out onto the street. "I'm dog-tired," Mom said, throwing her bag on the couch. "Lina, are you okay? You look tense." "It's okay," I replied, forcing myself to smile. "I was just thinking." She nodded without paying attention and turned to Roman. "Why are you so silent?" she asked with a slight smile. "Just listening," he replied, and his gaze flashed towards me, short but sharp, like a jab. Mom went into the kitchen, and I remained standing by the window, feeling the floor slipping away from under my feet. Roman stood up, walked over to the table, and said quietly, so that only I could hear, "This is not the end, Lina. We both know that." I didn't answer. He went after Mom, and I was left alone, looking at my reflection in the glass. My eyes were strange, not the same as the ones I had seen a week ago. Something inside me was broken, or maybe reborn. The next few days passed in a blur. I avoided him, but it was no use. He was in every corner of the house, in every sound, in every casual glance. Mom didn't notice anything, but I knew, sooner or later something had to happen. One night I was awakened by a noise. The clock showed 2 o'clock. I went out into the hallway, barefoot, and heard the floor of the living room creak. Roman was standing by the window, looking out onto the street, a glass in his hand. He turned around, noticing me, and something flashed in his eyes, not surprise, but anticipation. "Can't sleep?" he asked quietly. "No," I answered, stopping at the door. He nodded, put down his glass, and took a step toward me. I didn't back away. He stopped in his tracks, and the night around us grew thick as ink. "I won't touch you," he said, "but I can't stop thinking about you." His words hit me like a wave, and I felt my legs go weak. "And I can't stop being afraid," I said, and my voice was barely audible. "But I think too." He froze, looking at me, and in that moment I understood this was our culmination. Not a touch, not words, but a confession that neither of us could deny. We stood like that, separated by a step, but connected by something stronger than distance. "What next?" I asked, feeling my heart pounding in my throat. He didn't answer right away. He looked at me for a long time, heavily, and said, "It depends on you." I swallowed, feeling his words settle inside me like sand at the bottom of the sea. Then I turned and walked into my room, closing the door. But I knew it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something we couldn't yet understand. I woke up this morning feeling like everything had changed. Mom was making breakfast, Roman was reading the newspaper, and I was sitting at the table, looking at them. But his gaze, flickering over the pages, told me everything. That shadow hadn't gone anywhere, and one day it would return, to finish what we'd started, or to destroy everything we had.